Pollyanna, Chapter 27, To Visit. It was Nancy who was sent to tell Mr. John Pendleton of Mr. Meade verdicted. Miss Polly had remembered her promise to let him have direct information of from the houses, to go herself or to write a letter. She felt to be almost equally out of question. It occurred to her to send Nancy. There had been a time when Nancy would have rejoiced greatly at this extraordinary opportunity to see something of the house of mystery and its master, but today her heart was too heavy to rejoice at anything. She scarcely even looked about her at all. Indeed, during the few minutes she waited for Mr. Pendleton to appear, "I'm Nancy, sir," she said respectfully, in response to a surprised questioning of Miss Eyes when he came into the room. "Miss Harrington sent me to tell you about Miss Pollyanna." Well, in spite of the curtness of the word, Nancy quite understood the anxiety that lay behind the short "well." "It ain't well, Mr. Pendleton," she choked. "You don't mean—" He paused, and she bowed her head miserably. "Yes, sir. He says she can't walk again. Never." For a moment there was an absolute silence in the room. Then the man spoke in a voice shaken with emotion. "Poor little girl! Poor little girl!" Nancy glanced at him, but dropped her eyes at once. She had not supposed that sour, cross, stern John Pendleton could look like that. In a moment he spoke again, still a low, unsteady voice. "It seemed cruel never to dance in the sunshine again, my little prim's girl." There was another silence, then abruptly the man asked, "She herself doesn't know yet, of course, does she?" "But she does, sir," sobbed Nancy, "and that's what make it all harder. She found out that drat cat—" "I beg your pardon," I apologized the girl hurriedly. "It's only that the cat pushed open the door and Miss Pollyanna overheard them talking. She found out that way." "Poor little girl," sighed the man again. "Yes, sir, you would say, sir, if you could see her," choked Nancy. "I hadn't seen her but twice since she knew about it, and it done me both time. You see, all fresh and new to her, and she keep thinking all the time of new things she can't do now. It worries her, too, 'cause she can't seem to be glad. Maybe you don't know about her game, though," broke off Nancy apologetically. "The glad game?" asked the man. "Oh, yes, she told me of that." "Oh, she did? Well, I guess she has told it generally to most folk. But you see, now she can't play herself, and it's worried her. She says she can't think of not a thing, but about this not walking again, to be glad about." "Well, why should she?" retorted the man, almost savagely. Nancy shifted her head uneasily. "That's the way I felt, too, till I happened to think it would be easier if she could find something, so I tried to remind her of what?" John Pendleton was still angry and impatient. Of how she told others to play it. Miss Snow and the rest, and what does she said for them to do, but the poor little lamb just cry and say, it does seem the same, somehow. She said, it's easy to tell lifelong invalids now to be glad, but it ain't the same thing when you're lifelong invalids yourself and have to try to do it. She says she's told herself over and over again how glad she is that other folks ain't like her, but that all the time she's saying it, she ain't already thinking of anything, only how she could ever walk again. Nancy paused, but the man did not speak. He sat with a hand over his eyes. "Then I tried to remind her how she used to say the game was all nicer to play when it was hard," resumed Nancy in a dull voice. "But she say that too is different when it is hard. And I must be going now, sir." She broke off abruptly. At the door she hesitated, turned, and asked timidly, "I couldn't be telling Miss Pollyanna that you'd seen Jimmy Beans again, I suppose, sir, could I?" "I don't see how you could, as I haven't seen him," observed the man a little shortly. "Why, nothing, sir, only, well, you see, that's one of the things she was feeling bad about. She couldn't take him to see you now. She said she'd taken him once, but she didn't think he showed up very well that day, and that she was afraid you didn't think he would make a very nice child present after all. Maybe you know what she mean by that, but I didn't, sir." "Yes, I know what she means." "All right, sir. It was only that She was wanting to take him again. She said, so she showed you he really was a lovely child present, and now she can't drop the odium Bible. I beg your pardon, sir. Goodbye. And Nancy fled precipitately, and did not take a long for entire town on begging sleep to learn that the great New York doctor had said to Pollyanna Whitter could never walk again, and certainly never before had the town been so stirred. Everybody knew by sight of a new piquant little freckled faces had always a smile of greeting, and almost everybody knew of the game that Pollyanna was playing. To think that now, never again. But would that smiling face be seen on the street? Never again would that cheering little voice proclaim the gladness of some everyday experiment. It seemed unbelievable, impossible, cruel. In the kitchen and sitting room and over backyard fences, women talk of it and wept openly on street corner like, and in store and loving place the men talk about too, and wept through not so openly. And neither the talking nor the weeping grew less when fast on the heel news itself came Nancy pitifully story that Pollyanna face to face with that had come to her, with bemoaning most of all the fact that she could not play the game, that she could not now be glad over anything. It was then that the same thought must have in some way come to Pollyanna friends, and at all events, almost at once, the mistress of the Harrington home instead, greatly to her surprise, began to receive calls from people she knew, people she did not know, called from men, women, and children, many of whom Miss Polly had not supposed that her niece knew at all. Some came in, sat down for a stiff 5 or 10 minutes. Some stood awkwardly on the porch step, fumbling with hats or handbags according to their sex. Some brought a book, a bunch of flour, or dainty to attempt to plate it. Some cried frankly, some turned their back, blew their nose furiously, but all inquired very anxiously for the little injured girl, and all sent her some message. And it was all these messages which, after all, stirred Miss Polly to action. First came Mr. John Pendleton. He came without his crutch today. I don't need to tell you how shocked I am, he began almost harshly. But can nothing be done? Miss Polly gave a gesture of despair. Oh, we're doing, of course. All the time Dr. Mead presents certain treatment and medicine that might help. And Dr. Warren is carrying them out to the light of course, but Dr. Mead held almost no hope. John Pendleton rose abruptly, though he had but just come. His face was white, and his mouth was set into stern line. Miss Polly, looking at him, knew very well why he felt that he could not stay longer in her presence. At the door he turned. I have a message for Pollyanna, he said. Will you tell her, please, that I have seen Jimmy Beans, and that he's going to be my boy hereafter. Tell her that I thought she would be glad to know I shall adopt him properly. For a brief moment Miss Polly lost her unusual well-bred self-control. You will adopt Jimmy Beans? She gasped. The man lifted his chin a little. Yes, I think Pollyanna will understand. You will tell her I thought she would be glad. Why, of course, flattered Miss Polly. Thank you, bowed John Pendleton as he turned to go. In the middle of the floor, Miss Polly stood, silent and amazed, still looking after the man who had just left her. Even yet she could scarcely believe that her ears had heard. John Pendleton adopt Jimmy Beans? John Pendleton, wealthy, independent Morris, erupted immediately and supremely selfish to adopt a little boy, and such a little boy? With somewhat dazed face, Miss Polly went upstairs to Pollyanna's room. Pollyanna, I have a message for you from Mr. John Pendleton. He has just been here. He said to tell you he has taken Jimmy Bean for his little boy. He said he thought you would be glad to know it. Pollyanna's wistful little face flamed into sudden joy. Glad? Glad? Well, I reckon I'm glad. Oh, Aunt Polly, I've still wanted to find a place for Jimmy, and that's such a lovely place. Besides, I'm so glad for Mr. Pendleton, too. You see, now you have a child present. The what? Pollyanna colored painfully. She had forgotten that she had never told her aunt of Mr. Pendleton's desire to adopt her, and certainly she would not wish to tell her now that she had ever thought of a minute of leaving her, this dear Aunt Polly, the child presents, stammered Pollyanna hastily. Mr. Pendleton told me once, you see, that only a woman hands and a heart or a child present can make a home. And now he's got it, the child presents. Oh, I see, said Miss Polly very gently. And she did not see more than Pollyanna realized. She saw something of the pressure that was probably brought to bear on Pollyanna herself, that at the time John Pendleton was asking her to be the child presence, which was transformed as great pile of gray stone in a home. I see, she finished, her eyes stinging with sudden tears. Pollyanna, fearful that her aunt might ask further embarrassing questions, hesitated to lead the conversation away from Pendleton House and its master. Dr. Chilton says so, too, that it take a woman hand and heart or a child present to make a home, you know, she remarked. Miss Polly turned with a start. Dr. Chilton? How do you know that? He told me so. It was when he said he lived in just a room, you know, not a home. Miss Polly did not answer. Her eyes were out of the window, so I asked him why he didn't get him a woman hand and heart and have a home. Pollyanna, Miss Polly had turned sharply. Her cheeks showed a sudden color. Well, I did. He looked so sorrowful. What did he say? Miss Polly asked the question as if in spite of some force within her that was urging her not to ask it. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said very low that you couldn't always get him for the asking. There was a brief silence. Miss Polly's eyes had turned again to the window. Her cheeks were still unnaturally pink. Pollyanna sighed. He wants one, anyhow, I know, and I wish he could have one. Why, Pollyanna? How do you know? Because afterward, on another day, he said something else. He said that low, too, but I heard him. He said that he would give all the world, and he did have one woman hand and heart. Why, Aunt Polly, what's the matter? Aunt Polly had risen hurriedly, gone to the window. Nothing, dear. I was changing the position of the prims, said Aunt Polly, whose face now aflame. Chapter 28. The Game and Its Player. It was not long after John Pendleton's second visit that Millie Snow called one afternoon. Millie Snow had never seen this before seen at the Harrington homestead. She blushed and looked very embarrassed when Miss Polly entered the room. I came to inquire for a little girl, she stammered. You're very kind. She's about the same. How is your mother? Rejoined Miss Polly wearily. That is what I came to tell you. That is to ask you to tell Miss Pollyanna, hurried on the girl breathlessly and curtly. We think it's so awful, so perfectly awful that the little thing can't ever walk again. And after all she's done for us too, for mother, you know, teaching her to play the game and all that. And when we heard now she can't play it herself, poor little dear, I'm sure I don't see how she can either, and in her condition. But when we remember all the things she said to us, we thought if she could only be... She said... we had thought it could only know that she had done for us, and it would help, you know, in her own case, about the game, because she should be glad that it's a little glad. Miss Millie stopped helplessly and seemed to be waiting for Miss Polly to speak. Miss Polly had sat politely listening, but with a puzzled questioning in her eyes. Only about half of what had been said had she understood. She was thinking now that she always had known that Millie Snow was queer, but she had supposed she was crazy, and no other way, however, could she account in the incoherent, illogical, and meaning rush of words. When the pause came, she filled it with a quiet, I don't think I quite understand, Millie. Just what is it, you want to tell me, my niece? Yes, that's it. I want to tell her, answered the girl feverishly, and make her see what she's done for us. Of course she's seen something, because she's been there, and she's no mother's different, but I want her to know how different she is. And me too, I'm different. I've been trying to play the game a little. Miss Polly frowned. She would have asked what Millie meant by this game, but there was no opportunity. Millie was rushing on again with nervous volubility. Nothing was ever right before for Mother. She was always wanting him different, and really, I don't know as one could blame her much under the circumstance. But now she let me keeping the shade up and she take interest in things, how she look up and her nightdress and all that. And she's actually begun to knit like little things, reins and baby blanket for Fierce in hospital. And she's so interested and so glad to think she can do it. And that was all Miss Pollyanna doing, 'cause she told Mother she could be glad. She'd got her hand and arms anyway, and that made Mother wonder right away why she didn't do something with her hand and arms. And so she began to do something to knit, and you can't think what a different room it is now. What with the red and blue and yellow hornstone and the prims in the windows that she gave her, why, it actually make you feel better just to go in there now. And before I just dread it awfully, it was so dark and gloomy, and Mother was so, so unhappy, And so we want you to please tell Miss Pollyanna that we understand it's all because of her, and please say we're so glad we know her that we thought maybe if she knew it, it would make her a little glad that she knew us. And that's all, signed Millie, rising hurriedly to her feet. You'll tell her? Why, of course, murmured Miss Polly, wondering just how much of this remarkable discourse she could remember to tell. These visits of John Pendleton and Millie Snow were only the first of many, and always there were the message which were in some way curious that they caused Miss Polly more and more to puzzle over them. One day there was a little widow Benton. Miss Polly knew her well, though they never had called upon each other, but repugnantly she noticed the saddest little woman in town, one who was always in black. Today, however, Miss Benton wore a lot of pale blue in her throat. There were tears in her eyes. She spoke of her grief and horror in the accident, and she asked differently if she might see Pollyanna. Miss Polly shook her head. I'm sorry, but she's seen no one yet. A little later, perhaps. Miss Benton wiped her eyes, rose and turned to go, but after she had almost reached the hall door, she came back hurriedly. Miss Harrington, perhaps you would give her a message, she stammered. Certainly, Mrs. Benton, I shall be very glad to. Still, the little woman hesitated. Then she spoke. Will you tell her, please, that I've been put on this, she said, touching the blue bow in her throat. Then Miss Polly, ill-concealed look of surprise, she added. The little girl had been trying so long to make me wear some color that I thought she would be glad to know I'll begun. She said that Freddie would be glad to see it if I would. Freddie's all I have now. The other of all. Mrs. Benton shook her head and turned away. If you tell Paulina, she'll understand. And the door closed after her. A little later, the same day, there was the other widow. At least she wore widow garment. Miss Polly did not know her at all. She wondered vagably how Pollyanna could have known her. The lady gave her the name as Mrs. Tarbell. I'm a stranger to you, of course, she had begun at once, but I'm not a stranger to your little niece, Pollyanna. I've been at the hotel all summer, and every day I've had taken a long walk for my health. It was on these walks that I've met your niece. She's such a dear little girl. I wish I could make you understand what she's been to me. I was very sad when I came up here, and her bright face and cheery way reminded me of my own little girl that I lost years ago. I was so shocked to hear of the accident, and then when I learned that the poor child would never walk again, and that she was so unhappy because she couldn't be glad any longer, the dear child, I just had to come to you. You're very kind, murmured Miss Polly, but is it who are to be kind? Demurred the other. I want you to give her a message from me. Will you? Certainly. Will you tell her then that Mrs. Tarbell is glad now? Yes, I know it sounds odd and you don't understand, but if you'll pardon me, I'd rather not explain. Sad line came the lady's mouth, and the smile left her eyes. Your niece will know just what I mean. And I felt that I must tell her. Thank you, and pardon me, please, for any something rudeness in my call, she begged as she took her leave. Thoroughly mystified, now Miss Polly hurried upstairs to Pollyanna's room. Pollyanna, do you know a Mrs. Tarbell? Oh, yes, I love Mrs. Tarbell. She's sick and awfully sad, and she's at the hotel and take long walk. We go together. I mean, we used to. Pollyanna's voice broke, and with two big tears rolled down her cheeks. Miss Polly cleared her throat hurriedly. Well, she's just been here, dear. She left a message for you. She wouldn't tell me what it meant. She said to tell you that Mrs. Tarple is glad now. Paulina clapped her hands softly. Did she say that, really? Oh, I'm so glad. But, Pollyanna, what did she mean? Why, it's the game. And Pollyanna stopped short, her finger to her lips. What game? Nothing much, Aunt Polly. That is, I can't tell unless I tell other thing that I'm not to speak of. It was on Miss Polly's tongue to question her niece further. But the obvious distress in the little girl's face stayed the words before long the utter. Not long after Mrs. Talbot's visit, the climax came. It came in the shape of a call from a certain young woman with an unnaturally pink cheek and abundantly yellow hair. A young woman who wore high heel and cheap jewelry. A young woman whom Miss Polly knew very well by reputation, but whom she was angrily amazed to meet beneath the roof of Harrington Homestead. Miss Polly did not offer her hand. She drew back indeed as she entered the room. The woman rose at once. Her eyes were very red as she'd been crying. Half definitely, she asked if she might for a moment see the little girl, Pollyanna. Miss Polly said no. She began to say it very sternly, but something in the woman's pleading eyes made her add the civil explanation that no one was allowed to yet to see Pollyanna. The woman hesitated, then a little brusquely she spoke. Her chin was still at a silently defiant tilt. My name is Mrs. Payson. Mrs. Tom Payson. I presume you've heard me of most of the good people in the town have, and maybe some of the things you've heard ain't true, but never mind that. It's about the little girl I came. I heard about the accident. And it broke me all up. Last week I heard now she couldn't ever walk again. And I wish I could give up my too uselessly well leg for her. She would do more good trotting around in 1 hour than I could in 100 years. But never mind that. Legs ain't always given to the one who can make the best use of him. I know it is. She paused and cleared her throat. But when she resumed, her voice was still husky. Maybe you don't know it, but I've seen a good deal of that little girl of yours. We live on the Pendleton Hill Road, and she used to go by often, only she didn't always go by. She came in and played with the kids and talked to me and my man when he was home. She seemed to like it and to like us. She didn't know, I suspected, that her kind of folks don't generally call on my kind. Maybe they did call more, Miss Harrington. There wouldn't be so many of my kind, she added with sudden bitterness. Be that as it may, she came and she didn't do herself no harm. She didn't do us good. A lot of good. How much she won't know, nor can't know, I hope. 'Cause if she did, she would know other things that I don't want her to know. But it's just this. It's been hard time with us this year in more than one. We've been blue and discouraged. My man and me was ready for most anything. We was reckoning on getting a divorce about now and letting the kids, well, we didn't know what we would do with the kids. And came the accident, and we heard about the little girl never walking again, and we got to thinking how she used to come and sit on our doorstep and train with the kids and laugh and just be glad. She was always being glad about something, and then one day she told us why about the game, and tried to coax us to play it. Well, we heard now that she's freeing her poor little life out of her because she can't play it no more, and there's nothing to be glad about. And that's what I came to tell her today, that maybe she can be a little glad for us, because we've decided to stick to each other and play the game herself. I knew she would be glad because she used to feel kind of bad and things. We said sometime just how the game is going to help us. I can't say that I exactly see yet, but maybe it will. Anyhow, we're going to try, because she wanted us to. Will you tell her? Yes, I will tell her, promised Miss Polly a little faintly. Then, with a sudden impulse, she stepped forward and held out her hand. And thank you for coming, Mrs. Payson, she said simply. The defendant's chin fell, the lips above trembling visibly with an incoherent mumbled something. Mrs. Payson blindly clutched on the outstretched hand, turned and fled. The door had scarcely closed behind her before Miss Polly was confronting Nancy in the kitchen. Nancy, Miss Polly spoke sharply, the series of the puzzling disconcerting visit of the last few days culminating as they had an extraordinary experience of the afternoon, had strained her nerve to be snapping point. Not since Miss Polly Anna accident had Nancy had heard Miss Mistress speak so sternly. Nancy, will you tell me what this observed game is that the whole town seemed to be babbling about, and what place has my niece to do with it? Why does everybody, Millie Snow to Mrs. Tom Payson, send word at her and that they're playing it? As near as I judge, half the town are putting on blue ribbons or stopping family quarrels or learning like to something they never liked before. And all because of Pollyanna. I tried to ask her child herself about it, but I can't see too much headway. Of course, I don't like to worry her now, but from something I heard her say to you last night, I should judge you were one of them too. Now, will you tell me what it is all mean? To Miss Polly's surprise and dismay, Nancy burst into tears. It means that ever since last June, the Pledge Child just been making the whole town glad, and now they're turning around and trying to make her a little glad too. Glad of what? Just glad. That's the game. Miss Polly actually stamped her foot. There you go, all the rest, Nancy. What game? Nancy lifted her chin. She faced her mistress and looked her squarely in her eyes. I'll tell you, ma'am. It's a game Miss Pollyanna's father learned her to play. She got a pair of crutches in a missionary burial, and when she wanted a doll, and she cried, of course, like any child would, it was then her father told her that it wasn't ever anything, that it was something on that you could be glad about, and then she could be glad about them crutches. Glad for crutches? Miss Polly choked back a sob. She was thinking of the helpless little leg on the bed upstairs. Yes, ma'am, that's what I said, and Miss Pollyanna said that she said too, but he told her she could be glad because she didn't need him. Oh, cried Miss Polly, and after that she said he made a regular game of it, finding something and everything to be glad about. And she said you could do it too, and that you didn't seem to mind not having dolls so much, because you were so glad you didn't need the crutches, and they called it the Just Being Glad game. That's the game, ma'am. She's played ever since. But how? How? Miss Polly came to a helpless pause. And you'll be surprised to find out how cute how cute it worked, ma'am, too, maintained Nancy with the utmost eagerness of Polly herself. I wish I could tell you that's a lot she's done on her mother and the folk out home. She's been to see him, twice with me. She's made me glad too on such a lot of things, little things and big things, such as made him so much easier. For instance, I don't mind Nancy for name, however, such as she told me I could be glad it wasn't Heavis. Heavisabel. There's a Monday morning too that I used to hate, so she's actually made me glad for Monday morning. Glad for Monday morning? Nancy laughed. I know it does sound nutty, ma'am, but let me tell you, that blessed lamb found out I hated Monday morning, something awful, and what does she up and tell me one day but this? Well, anyhow, Nancy, I should think you could be glad on Monday morning than any other day in the week, because it would be a whole week before you have another one, and I'm blessed I hadn't though it every morning, and I'm blessed if I hadn't thought of every Monday morning since, and it has helped, ma'am. It made me laugh. Anyhow, every time I thought of it, and laughing helped, It does. But why hasn't she told me the game? Flatter Miss Polly was she's just mystery of it, and ask her. Nancy hesitated, begging your pardon, ma'am. She told her not to speak of her father, and so she couldn't tell you. It was her father game, you see. Miss Polly bit her lips. She wanted to tell you first off, continued Nancy a little unsteadily. She wanted somebody to play it with. That's why I begun it, so she could have someone. And these other, Miss Polly's voice shook now. Oh, everybody most know it now. I guess anyhow, I should think they did from the way I'm hearing it of everywhere I go. Of course, she told a lot, and they told the rest think go. When they get started, and she was always so smiling and pleasant to everyone, and so just to be glad herself all the time. Now they couldn't be glad knowing it anyhow. Now since she heard everybody feel so bad, especially when they heard how bad she feel, because she can't find anything to be glad about, and they've been coming every day to tell her how glad she's made them, hoping that they'll help some. You see, she's always wanted everybody to play the game with her. Well, I know somebody who'll play it now, choked Miss Polly, so she turned and sped through the kitchen doorway. Behind her, Nancy stood staring amazingly. Well, I believe anything now, she muttered herself. Wait, you can't stop me with anything. I won't believe now of Miss Polly. A little later, in Pollyanna room, the nurse left Miss Polly and Pollyanna alone together. And you haven't still another caller today, my dear? Announced Miss Polly in a voice she vainly tried to steady. Do you remember Mrs. Payson? Mrs. Payson? Why, I reckon I do. She lived on the way to Miss Pendleton, and she's got the prettiest little girl, baby 3 years old, and a boy most 5. She's awfully nice, and so her husband, and so is her husband, only they don't seem to know how nice each other is. Sometimes they fight. I mean, they don't quite agree. They're poor, too. They say, of course, they don't ever have burials because he isn't a missionary minister, you know, like, well, he isn't. A faint color stole in Pollyanna's cheek, which was duplicated suddenly in those of her aunt. But she wears a real pretty clothes sometimes, in spite of their being so poor, resumed Pollyanna in some haste. And she's got perfectly beautiful ring with diamond and rubies and emerald in them. But she said she's got one ring too many and that she's going to throw it away and get a divorce instead. What is a divorce, Aunt Polly? I'm afraid it isn't very nice because she didn't look happy when she talked about it. And she said if she did get it, they wouldn't live there anymore and Mr. Payson would go way off and maybe the children too. But I should think they'd rather keep the ring if they did have so many more. Shouldn't you, Aunt Polly? What is a divorce? But they aren't going way off, dear, invaded Aunt Polly hurriedly. They're going to stay right there together. Oh, I'm so glad. Then they'll be there when I go to see off, dear, broke off the little girl miserably. Aunt Polly, why can't I remember that my legs don't go anymore, and then I won't ever go up to see Mr. Pendleton again? There, don't choke her aunt, perhaps. They'll drive up sometime. But listen, that all that Mrs. Payson said, going to stay together and play the game as you just wanted them to. Pollyanna smiled through the tear-wet eyes. Did they? Did they really? Oh, I'm glad of that. Yes, she said she hopes you'll be glad. That why she told you to make you glad, Pollyanna. Pollyanna looked up so quickly. Why, Aunt Polly? You spoke as if you knew. Do you know about the game, Aunt Polly? Yes, dear. Miss Polly sternly forced her voice to be cheerfully matter-of-fact. Nancy told me. I think it's a beautiful game. I'm going to play it with you. Oh, Aunt Polly, you? I'm so glad. You see, I've really wanted you most of anybody all the time. Aunt Polly caught her breath a little sharply. It was even harder this time to keep her voice steady, but she did it. Yes, dear, and there are all those other two. Why, Pollyanna? I think all the town is playing the game now with you, even to the minister. I haven't had a chance to tell you yet. But this morning, I met Mr. Ford when I was down to the village, and he told me to say to you that as soon as you could see him, he was coming to tell you that he ain't stopped being glad over those 800 rejoicing texts that you told him about. So you see, dear, it's just you that you have done it. The whole town is playing the game, and the whole town is wonderfully happier, and because of one little girl who taught the people a new game and how to play it. Pollyanna clapped her hands. Oh, I'm so glad, she cried. Then suddenly a wonderful light illuminated her. Why, Aunt Polly, there's something I can be glad about after all. I can be glad I've had my leg anyway. Else I couldn't have done that.